Hello, Agape Church and friends. Welcome in to the Building Up podcast. This is episode number 89. I'm David. Thank you for being with us this week. We are going to continue talking in today's podcast episode about total forgiveness. Now, if you have not heard last week's episode number 88, please go back and listen to that episode first, because it is really the foundational teaching that we're going to build on today. I do want to again give credit for this podcast, much of the material in it, to Dr. R.T. Kendall and his book, Total Forgiveness. Dr. Kendall was a minister at Westminster Chapel in London for over 25 years. He wrote a very sturdy book on forgiveness that I suggest to people who are wrestling with this topic or wanting to learn more about it so that you can help others who may be wrestling with it. You can find that book out on Amazon.com for a very reasonable price. Now, last week on the podcast, we began talking about total forgiveness, and we talked about a couple of foundational things that we are, as Christians, commanded to forgive, called to forgive. We also talked how our motivation for forgiveness is that we have been forgiven. So when God calls us to forgive, God is calling us to be like Him. He's calling us to do the things that He has done, specifically what He has done for us. And it's very important that we know that the Bible shows us that if there's someone who's deeply hurt us, and we're not willing to work through forgiveness, we know God's calling us to that, but we're just refusing it, that can actually harm us spiritually. That can take away our own peace. It can grieve the Holy Spirit. It can interrupt our fellowship with the Father. In none of that are we saying that it's an easy thing to forgive. So I don't mean that if you are wrestling with forgiveness and what it looks like, and you're trying, but you're finding it really hard, I don't mean that is what's going to harm you spiritually or take away your peace. I'm talking about when you know God's calling you to forgive someone and you're just pushing back on that or ignoring it, walking away from it. That can actually harm us spiritually. And we need to know that when we talk about total forgiveness. Now, on last episode, the last podcast episode, we talked about 5 things total forgiveness is not. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 things total forgiveness is. Now, as we go through this list, I want to say a couple of things. Please keep in mind that the majority of the forgiving that you're going to need to do in your life will be daily with the people closest to you. All right. Just daily walking through life, people in your family, people in your church, people in your circle of friends. You're going to need to arm yourself with tools ready to forgive people the same as you want them to be ready to forgive you. But there are going to be times where you're going to need to forgive someone who has hurt you really deeply. Perhaps a willful hurt or even a continual hurt. You're going to have to forgive someone that you don't know. You might have to forgive someone that you don't have an ongoing relationship with. You might have to forgive someone who's already passed away. So as we walk through this list of things that forgiveness is, I want to counsel you that going through this list may be a very good start for you, but it probably won't be the end if you have really deep hurts. You may have to walk through some of these things with someone in your life who you trust, who loves you, and who loves God. A good godly counselor who could help you apply some of the principles of total forgiveness. So keep that in mind as we go through this list. These are things you need to be reminded of every day for people closest to you, but also things that you may need to be reminded of for those deep wounds that all of us will suffer at some point from someone. All right, 5 things that total forgiveness is. Number 1, total forgiveness is an act of your will before it is a feeling. Forgiveness is an act of the will. It is a choice that you make. You are making a choice when you forgive to say, I'm not going to hold this in, and I'm not going to hold this against this person. I'm going to release them from what they've done. And again, I want to remind you, please make sure you've listened to podcasts from last week, because it's important, some of the things we covered about what that doesn't mean. Like, it doesn't mean you're excusing them. It doesn't mean you're approving what they did. It doesn't mean you're minimizing it or turning a blind eye to it. But you are saying, you hurt me, and I'm going to release you. I'm not going to hold this over your head. I think this is very important for those people that are closest to us. When we forgive someone, it means I'm not going to keep bringing this up. I'm not going to try to continually remind you of this. I'm not going to relate to you by this event that you have done. I'm not going to try to seek revenge. I'm not going to do things toward you that look like hatred. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do things for you that are good. Maybe I'm going to pray for you, or I'm going to do good deeds to you. I'm going to try to think about good qualities that you have. A lot of times we may think, I'll forgive when I feel like it, but the fact is we'll never feel like it. We need to know that forgiveness is an act of our will and that our feelings may change later. They may not. But when we forgive, we're choosing. We may not feel any different at first because it is primarily an act of our will. Number 2, total forgiveness is a refusal to punish someone relationally for what they did. And again, thinking primarily of people that are closest to us in our lives. Romans 12:19 says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves. Leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." Now that's a great verse for you to apply even to people who have harmed you deeply from a distance, people that are not in your relational circles anymore. But it's also a verse to think through for people that we live with and we go to church with and we're friends with, that when people hurt us intentionally, it's not for us to try and avenge that and get back at them. We talked about it last week, but sometimes when we don't forgive, it's because we have a fear that we're going to be letting someone off the hook. We're excusing what they did. And so if we forgive them, they're not actually going to receive what is due them for their sin. And total forgiveness means you're submitting yourself to this truth, that vindication is God's and God's alone. We are not God's instrument of punishment in the lives of people who have hurt us. We have to release that idea. It's even possible that if we try to get revenge on someone who's hurt us, that we might actually harm true justice in the process because we're taking it out of God's hands. We might be tempted to punish someone relationally by withholding ourselves from them. This happens a lot in marriages. By being mean to them or keeping our distance from them, shunning them, not talking to them at church, not talking to them at family reunions. We might even go as far as telling other people what they did and asking others to not go around them. So we have to know that if we're truly forgiving people, it means that we're refusing to take punishment into our own hands and punishing someone relationally for what they did. We're leaving that to the Lord. Number 3, total forgiveness is a refusal to tell everyone what that person did. Total forgiveness is a choice to not gossip about a person or what they did to us. We have to know, church, God hates gossip. In Romans 1, gossip is listed with sins such as envy and murder and deceit, haters of God, the arrogant, and the inventors of evil. So talking about what someone did to us in order to try to hurt them or hurt their reputation or destroy their credibility, at the end of the day, that's a form of punishment. Even if we share it with someone because we say, I just want you to pray through this with me. But in the back of our mind, if we're honest, we know I'm really just wanting to tell people about it. Now, let's go back to how we're forgiven. We talked about this last week as well. God forgives us, and we are to forgive others the way God has forgiven us. God doesn't uncover every sin that we commit. When God forgives us, sometimes God even covers up or hides that sin. He doesn't try to embarrass us. He doesn't try to keep the offense alive. Now, if God does uncover a sin, it is for our own good. And God knows how to do that, but we don't know how to do that for someone else. We need to let God handle that. Now, I do want to say sometimes we need to talk with someone through a situation because we don't know how to process it on our own, and we don't truly know how to forgive someone. That's really different than gossip. But I think you should test yourself on whether or not you are getting counsel or you're gossiping. If if you're going to get counsel, you can often do that without actually revealing the person that has hurt you, without identifying them or saying anything where someone could figure it out. And also, if you're going to go after counsel, it's normally from one trusted friend or one authority figure. It's a close circle of people. If you're getting counsel from about a dozen people at one time, it's probably more gossip than counsel. And you can get counsel from someone who you know is trustworthy, and you know they won't hold this against the person who did it. They won't tell other people about it. So I know I can trust them to protect that person and protect me as I walk through this. That's very important when we think about forgiveness. Number 4. Total forgiveness is relinquishing bitterness. Bitterness is an inward condition. Bitterness is an excessive desire for vengeance. It comes out of a deep resentment towards someone else. And Hebrews chapter 12 tells us that if we have bitterness in us, it becomes like this root in the soil of our hearts, and eventually that root is going to grow a weed, and it is going to cause a lot of trouble, and it might defile many. Bitterness ends up defiling or hurting many people. Bitterness can lead us to miss God's grace. Bitterness can manifest itself in a lot of ways in our lives. When we're bitter, sometimes we lose our temper easily. We might have health problems, high blood pressure. We might find ourselves being really irritable. Maybe we can't sleep. We constantly have a negative perception of people or our lives or the world. Some people who are bitter even find themselves depressed, or they find themselves obsessed with trying to get even with someone else. So forgiveness is relinquishing bitterness. It's working to get that unforgiveness out of our hearts before it hurts us and those around us. And how would you know if your bitterness is gone, or it's at least being worked out of your life? And I would say that if you desire to forgive someone in your heart, and you're actively trying to walk that forgiveness out and figure out what it looks like, I think that's a really good sign that you're not being controlled by bitterness. It may still be in there, but it's not as deep as it could be. The more we see the desire to get even with someone or punish them, the more we see that desire gone from our life, lessening in our hearts, the more we can truly wish someone well in all that they do and all the circumstances of their life. I think that's a good sign bitterness is being worked out of us. Finally, number 5, total forgiveness is setting the person who has hurt us free emotionally. Again, I'm thinking about people who are really close to us in those relationship circles in our churches and our families. But when you forgive someone, you are releasing someone from the debt they owe you. Forgiveness is an attitude that you portray. And this would be true even of someone who has hurt you really deeply. The attitude that you show toward other people when that person is brought up, that shows a lot about whether or not you have forgiven that person and set them free from what they've done. Are you pleasant to that person when they're around? You know, Jesus looks at us, he's forgiven us, and he looks at us and he says, I'm here, don't be afraid. Like, we don't have to be afraid of being in the presence of Christ because he's forgiven us. Would our presence in the life of the person that we need to forgive, would it communicate something similar? Like, you don't have to be afraid that I'm here? Would we be able to put them at ease? You don't have anything to fear from me. You don't have to worry about what I'm going to say to you. You don't have to worry about how I'm going to act toward you. I don't hold anything against you. Maybe even if a conversation came up about the offenses they have done to you, what would that communication sound like? Would you put them at ease? Or would you take that opportunity to send them on a guilt trip for what they've done? If they showed remorse to you, would you help them through that guilt? Would you assist them through it? Would you be able to say, I release you from guilt. I release you from fear of what I might do or say. I release you from the concerns of vengeance or retribution that you may have, that I may try to punish you for what you've done. I release you from those things. I even release you from reimbursement. You're free. You're free. That is what total forgiveness looks like, releasing someone. Now, again, I want to say, I think probably this list today was a little bit more difficult than the list last week. And I want to encourage you that if you're really struggling with forgiveness, especially a deep wound or hurt that someone has placed on you, you probably need to walk through that with someone. And your desire to do that is a good sign. We would love to help here at Agape Church. So if you go to church here, or even if you don't, if you want to talk to someone about a forgiveness issue, please email us, buildingup@agapepinson.com. That message will come directly to me, and I will read it, and I will get in touch with you, and I would be glad to try to maybe help talk with you through whatever that particular situation may be, or find a good, trusted, godly counselor in your life that you won't gossip, won't talk about what you're sharing with them, but they can help you walk through some of these issues. Church, I hope this has been helpful, and thank you for listening today. Until next time, grace and peace to your family. Thank you for listening to the Building Up Podcast, a ministry of Agape Church in Pinson, Alabama. If you have a question about today's podcast or would like to suggest a topic for the future, please email us, buildingup@agapepinson.com. To subscribe to this podcast, simply search for Building Up from Agape Church in your favorite podcast app. So fierce, he looked straight into me and said, "Son, I've given you victory. I can hear